Well, the name I use for development is Elfsire, but my real name is Hunter, and I'm working on the game Path of Achra. It's sort of a traditional adjacent roguelike. It's turn-based pixel graphics, sort of about making builds, and that's what I'm working on.
So you've kind of got a like early alpha version that people can try out currently. I'm kind of curious. How long have you been working on the project before you decided to put it up?
I started working on it in January. It's sort of like I wanted to learn to actually make a standalone game. So I started to learn Godot, the game engine, in like September last year, so about a year ago. My brother and my dad were all trying to make games at the same time, and my brother was working on a roguelike, and I wanted to give him sprites for a gift, and I really enjoyed making sprites, so I made all these roguelike sprites. But then that just made me want to make a roguelike, and this is basically in January, and that's when I started.
But before we kind of elaborate too much on Path of Achra, I'm kind of curious, what is the past work that you've done? Because I know that you were saying that you were just competing with family to try and make games, but what are some past things that you've worked on, and what's kind of your gaming background, I guess?
I've played a lot of Dungeon Crawl, Stone Soup, and Tales of Majel, sort of in the past 10 years. But I grew up just sort of playing games that everyone played, but mostly I played Warcraft 3, which had a custom map editor. And that's basically all the game development I've ever done is within the Warcraft 3 game. So making custom maps and that kind of thing. We didn't really do programming. You could kind of it was basic scripting. So I'm learning how to do all that kind of painfully, which I knew it would be. But it was cool because with that kind of thing, it's sort of pure, you just get to sort of experiment with pure sort of game design because everything's provided already. You have the game environment, you have all the assets. You're just sort of, depending on how much you change the base game, you can just sort of make ideas and then immediately test them in multiplayer and that kind of thing. So that's the bulk of my game development history. I've been making Warcraft 3 maps since I was 10. That game sort of recently went through a dramatic spiral. You probably have heard about that, but
yeah, with Warcraft 3 we reforged.
Yeah, so I absolutely love that idea of a community where people make their own games and share them freely. And it was a very sort of utopian thing in terms of game design. But it also it contains you within that. You can't really
once you've made a game within that framework, you can't export it to another store and sell it or something. Unless you go the Dota route, which is just, rebuilding it from the ground up in a different engine.
Yeah, and that's sort of that's sort of what happens. It was a place to just sort of for people to iterate ideas and refine them until it gets to the point where there's so much sort of tension about it being limited to Warcraft 3 that they just make their own game. There's a couple other games from Warcraft 3 that have been made as standalones, but they're not Dota is huge. Nothing's as big as that, and arguably that whole genre of MOBAs and League of Legends and everything came from those sort of ideas that got iterated on over and over.
That and Tower Defense largely came from there as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I always kind of thought it did, but I think it existed. It's definitely a genre that would come out of having a real-time strategy game that you're modifying because it takes apart. And this is why I always kind of like tower defenses because it takes the anything that takes the micro out of a strategy game, I enjoy. And that was one of the first sort of ideas in that realm is you don't control units, you just make buildings and defend. That was always kind of exciting to me.
So let's talk a little bit about roguelikes briefly. How did you get into DCSS?
I sort of reached a point where I wasn't like when I was really young, I tended to have the newest sort of computers, and that sort of tapered off. And I realized I couldn't really just keep playing new games, and I got really kind of angry about that. I got angry about the idea that I had to keep upgrading my computer or keep buying new game systems. And I liked RPGs. I liked dungeon crawlers, like Dungeon Siege. I really liked that. It's just a sort of a random game that um, was out back in the day. It was one of the first 3D dungeon crawlers, but I sort of became very intent on finding like games that I could enjoy sort of infinitely, that didn't need me, like they didn't need expensive hardware. I guess those are the two things, and that's sort of what attracted me to roguelikes. And then everything else about them is so interesting, like the idea of I mean, I don't know what this term even means anymore. Just like generating, like emergent generation, you know, creating surprises and like details and situations that aren't expected. That's sort of what mostly drew me to it. The idea that like you're experiencing newness, but and also that, like, you know, just a medieval fantasy dungeon crawler. I'll play anything that's sort of like that.
Awesome. Well, let's I guess move this conversation a little bit towards your game now. So Path of Achra. Like this video and this interview is kind of happening because like we kind of got talking on Twitter after I put out a tweet that I was working on a video on the very early alpha that you have up for free on itch right now, or demo, or whatever wording you're using. And a few things kind of like caught me off guard when I was messing around with it. Mostly just about how streamlined and almost auto playing it is, but also that it's kind of, there's a lot to it already in just the build variety and depth there. So I guess kind of like my first question is like, when you started working on Godot, what made you decide that you wanted to make a roguelike initially?
I think first of all, because it's the kind of game I like to play these days. I think the fact that Rift Wizard came out so recently really encouraged me. Like I knew that people always sort of enjoy that kind of thing, and I wanted to make a game that other people would like. I think seeing Rift Wizard come out sort of, that I took that as like permission to make a game where you're just making builds and stuff, and it's like you're just like creating powerful combos within like a sort of a traditional roguelike look, like sort of a retro look. And the reason I like that look is that I really like making the sprites. I think I definitely like that more than programming. I just really like doing the art, and it's doable. Like with a roguelike scope, it's very like doable for one person. And since I'm doing everything, I felt like I sort of wanted to have a game where I learned. I guess it also started as a learning project. Like I wanted to learn how to like make a standalone game, and this felt like the type of thing that I could finish, because I sort of like the parts that I enjoy are making the sprites and making the abilities. And that sort of like was going to be the bulk of the content, ideally.
Is like sprite variety and ability and build variety. I know that you've cited a few games specifically, like I know that you mentioned Tome or Tales of Majel and Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup as games that you really like to play, and you've cited Rift Wizard now. Like, what were kind of the main inspirations, I guess, for the game itself? Like, when you sat down and started working, you're like, all right, what is something I'm going to look at and I'm going to draw from this thing to start building? Or is it just kind of paint thrown at the wall?
It was definitely those three. I think I was describing it. I think I described it in some tweet early on as like, I want a game like Rift Wizard that feels like I'm playing a Minotaur Berserker in Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup. That was sort of my like vibe I wanted. Like I wanted some, because I like roguelikes, but I really liked in Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup the auto attack button. And like I liked that I could, like, if I wanted to, I could play it in a way where I'm just sort of like, if I'm at a state where I'm powerful and I'm winning levels easily, I can sort of sit back and kind of like sort of chill out a little bit, I guess. and gotta like receive treasure and items and stuff, and it feels like it's a very sort of primitive desire, but I wanted to sort of have a game with lots of build complexity and depth and options, but that also allowed you to play it very sort of primitively. That's it's like Rift Wizard is like the best thing I've seen come out recently, but and this is a personal flaw. Like I have difficulty playing games that require, I guess, like intelligence for a long time. Like I like that kind of game, but I also like to just like put together like powers and watch myself become powerful and sort of, and even if I'm dying over and over, like I like it when it's like, I don't know, there are less decisions to make, I guess. I like that fluidity. That's sort of what I'm striving for.
It's kind of like a roguelike power fantasy.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. And particularly like the roguelike allows for that power fantasy in a way that like, because you can get so detailed with like, and you can, because the scope, like it's so easy to create assets and do sprite work. Like you can make so many like combinations and items and abilities. You can like, I've played games that are like, it's like a power fantasy, but it's really for me like enjoyable and I guess addictive when the power fantasy is something that you can design. I think about Magic the Gathering a lot too. Like that's something I really enjoyed, and it was like an early realization I had when I was playing that a lot, that I liked making decks more than I liked actually like playing well or like playing correctly or like I had a friend who was like really into making optimal plays, and he didn't care about what deck he was using, and like that I didn't understand that. Like my pleasure was in like creating these decks that are like expressions of a theme, and like I don't know, that's something that I strive to create. That's like what I enjoy most, is the idea of like creating something powerful that has like a theme and has like a character to it that sort of makes sense. It's just randomly another game I played recently, Backpack Hero. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's on itch. I think they're
Yeah,
bringing it to
very
Steam.
successful little Kickstarter.
Very successful. Yeah, they that game does a really good job, like with the build making, like making it feel like the theme sort of matches how the power is expressed. Sort of like the big swords feel like you're like playing a simple build with big swords, and then there's like complex things with magic stones and stuff. That kind of thing is what is like that type of thing I enjoy. That sort of like design.
So when you're building like Path of Achra, because the way the game works currently for anybody who hasn't played it is you essentially can hit tab to just auto attack whatever the nearest thing is and move towards the nearest thing, or you can control the game with the mouse. And I guess kind of the next question I have here is, are you trying to balance the game towards auto playing itself, or are you trying to like kind of have a combination of the player being very specific about what they're targeting, or are you building the game purely as kind of a build focused numbers game?
I definitely want there to be sort of decisions that you have to make when fighting things. The autoplay thing, actually, I like put all this work into adding that because it was so painful to test it when it only had mouse controls. Like I was hurting my wrist, and yeah, I think like it's sort of like just, I mean, so I started making it with the intention of like it being on the phone, like being able to use a touch screen for it, which I sort of shifted away from. But then that turned into mouse control. And now I've been slowly trying to incorporate the keyboard into the game. But like, yeah, as to your question, like I don't know if one precludes the other, like if having a game that's easy to play that can be played by pressing tab sort of precludes being able to make like a game where you have to think about every single movement. I think if I had to choose one, I would choose the one where you could like you're able to sort of press tab for most of it. But I don't know. I think it's something I'm still like the design is still kind of volatile right now. That's sort of why I released it as a like released on itch, just because I wanted to know what people thought was fun about it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like an example that I can kind of think of with this is like Caves of Cud has its auto explore option, right? Which generally is like not the majority of the game, but it's certainly a large portion of the game is just hitting that auto explore button. But whenever you do end up in a really tense situation, it's like, all right, I got to use this ability, then I got to back out into this menu and like use a consumable. And I like that. That is like kind of what I live for, because there's large, and like DCSS has like the auto explore too. It's like I really like the auto explore until I don't like it, and then I want to be able to have that finite control. And something that I found when playing like the initial demo, and I guess maybe this is just a feedback session now, but like when I was playing the initial alpha, I really kind of felt like I didn't have enough control in places, and I found that a little bit frustrating. Having like the autoplay option is really cool, and as like a super early game, like, like you've been working on this for less than a year, right? For a super early game, I think it's a really neat foundation, and I'm curious to see where it goes in that regard, which is why I asked the question about like, what was your goal? Are you trying to make this more of an automatic, like just playing itself type game, or am I going to have more control from the player perspective?
Yeah, and I think by control, do you mean like so like when you enter a level, you could just be surrounded by enemies and you have no control over that. Is that the type of thing you mean?
Yes. Like that kind of thing is frustrating.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that is something that I'm going to work on.
It's not like, even necessarily that it's frustrating. It's just it feels like I have no agency in that
situation.
situation.
It's different than like wandering into an area and seeing the enemies on the edge of the screen and then deciding whether to go towards them. Like you just
sure.
It's like you're dropping through the floor over and over. And you don't really know what it's gonna be. Yeah, that's something that like I'm working on, because obviously it's hard. I don't know. Like I do want that sort of decision making. Like I want it to feel like you can sort of move around and find a good spot, and like it's not like that's sort of. I mean, it's an interesting question, because like the potential that you could spawn in the center of like 10 ranged enemies that are instantly going to kill you is sort of I mean it is game ruining in a sense, like the fact that can happen. But I think the challenge is sort of like finessing the level generation to create scenarios that feel like they are sort of spontaneous, but also somehow kind of prevent stuff that feels really unfair. That's like the very like subtle art of generation that I'm still sort of learning to do, and it's definitely something I'm interested in developing further.
So something else that you mentioned in our like Twitter conversation was world building and storytelling, and I'm kind of curious. It's like, what is your kind of, if you have one, vision for this world? And like I remember you saying that games that can generate their own stories or feel compelling or interesting to you. So I'm just kind of curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit and how that links to your goals with
I think
Arca.
Yeah, in terms of like I think about that a lot, because I think about this game and how I sort of like I feel like I'm designing towards a very like sort of game centric roguelike as opposed to a narrative generator. And I sort of like I like both games. I don't really think that it can be one and not be the other. But there's like a level of So and I even hesitate to call this game a roguelike because it doesn't have generated weapons. The enemies aren't like themselves randomly generated. They're sort of fixed. And that's stuff that like is like I'm not doing a lot of the things that are most exciting to me because it feels like the more I work on this, it sort of is like crystallizing into a certain type of design where it's about sort of like combining fixed elements and creating builds out of that. Like the items, like the equipment pickup, as opposed to like generated items that have narrative sort of connection to something, to like a generated history, like Caves of Cut or something. Um, the items in this are like they're like Slay the Spire artifacts. Like they have a fixed ability, and you
Mhm.
just like you have like basically six of them that you can have on you, and that's like a design decision that has to do with making a feeling of progression, like in power progression, but it's not. It feels more like I think when I think about narrative generation roguelikes, I think about like how that's something I want to do in the next project and really focus on it. Because I feel like in this one, it's sort of become focused on creating something that feels like fun to play as a game. Like it's a type of thing that's you're very aware it's a game when you're playing it. It's not like a world creator. But so I don't know. I try to add I try to add narrative things like in the little boss messages and death messages and stuff like that. But like as I've developed it, that sort of like there used to be more text and more like sort of combined sentences and that kind of thing. But it's slowly been sort of removed as I've made something that like I think you mentioned like something that looks less overwhelming. I think I've sort of like I've been drifting towards just trying because I'm trying to keep the scope small, obviously, so that I can
Mhm.
finish it because these things get out of control really easily. And I'm trying to like kind of focus on like what if I make a game that's just very like because it's so easy. There's still stuff in it that is overwhelming, like overwhelming text, information that you have to read, like anything that's longer than like a sentence is. I mean, it's kind of unacceptable in terms of like something that's like clear for someone just to look at quickly. Like, and that's still present in certain things, certain descriptions. So I don't know. It's sort of like my focus has been on like making something in a very complex sort of genre that is easy to like relatively easy to look at and easy to see what's happening, but that has sort of distracted from making something that like can generate really cool like paragraphs of narrative that you can read and that you can connect to like an experience. It's just sort of like it's something I talk about with dissatisfaction because I felt like I've chosen one thing over the other for this project.
I don't think it necessarily needs to be one thing over the other. I mean, you can have elements of both without going too far down the rabbit hole and just becoming another Dwarf Fortress. And I don't think I don't think everything needs to be that.
Oh yeah,
Um,
for sure.
but like there's little flourishes that you have where it's just like character name is this of this religion and little things like that that I think really kind of go a long way when we're talking about a very role playing heavy genre. I mean, roguelikes are like they are the role playing game, right? You go play a role, have fun.
Yeah, that's good to know that like feels good because that is why like I was very like I really wanted like titles and things like that to be visible and like yeah like the boss like intro message when you enter a level that kind of thing. It's something where like my educational background is in like poetry and literature, so like the idea that roguelikes can generate narrative has always been like fascinating to me. But like in practice, I mean, at least in this project, I'm ending up being very sort of minimalist with the text because I don't know, I it's the type of thing that I had to experiment more with. But I like anything that's longer, I feel sort of dissatisfying and like it's not. I think I might just be like sort of overly sensitive to paragraphs of exposition, even though I love it in other games. Like when I actually try to do it, like I feel like I don't know. I have trouble doing it myself, I guess.
So, it's kind of bouncing into something else that we were kind of discussing is accessibility and readability. I do kind of have to applaud you. I mean, like, I found the game to be super easy to parse, and I figured it out rather quickly. Granted, I played too many of these, so
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
I'm definitely like the target demographic for this kind of thing. So that maybe means that me stating that it's approachable is maybe off base, but there's a lot of things that you do in the game that I think are really nice. Like the very large text scroll at the bottom that makes it super clear as to what's happening. The nice little color coded effects make it easier to just kind of skim read things once you've finished stuff. But like, kind of what is you do you have a like a mode of focus when you're working on making a game like this accessible? Because um, I find this genre of games to be very accessible for visually impaired people, as I am one, and I can just kind of stare at things and take things at my own time, at my own speed, and end up playing too fast and dying anyway. But I digress. Hubris is bliss.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I do find that these games are very approachable, but for a the problem is then is you have this niche audience that finds these games approachable, and everybody else looks at them and goes, ah, scary pixels. So I'm kind of curious, like when you're designing like UI elements or abilities or even like your text boxes, like do you have anything that you're kind of thinking about, or are you just kind of flying by the seat of your pants?
I think there's a bit of seat of the pants. I mean, it's been redone a bunch of times, and based on of people sort of giving feedback. It's a really difficult thing to design when you're making it because you sort of like you know what it's supposed to say, you know what it means, and it's hard to like look at it as someone that doesn't know what it means, and sort of imagine what that's like. Like so again, like every now and then my dad will look at it and he'll tell me I don't know how to start the game. And that's like, that's like I think getting feedback like that over and over was sort of pushed me to make, for one, like making sure if you hover over something, it'll tell you what it does for the most part. Um, Sort of the colored descriptions and having consistent colors between like for like if you're talking about a type of damage or an effect or like a type of stat, and then having sort of a consistent language in the ability descriptions, like sort of this. If it like so like if something gives armor and then gives a resistance, it'll say it in that order. It'll never say it with your resistance first, then armor. I don't know how much that's really helpful, but I found that like trying to create like a consistent sort of common pattern to the language so that it doesn't necessarily have to be squinted at every time you want to understand it can be helpful. A lot of like, and I learned this when I was making Warcraft 3 maps because I was trying to make maps that did different things in the base game. So I was creating all these abilities and mechanics, and like notoriously like the philosophy among those map makers is that nobody is ever going to read your tooltips, no matter what. So that's like the that's like the most sort of like brutal expectation possible. So sort of working with that expectation is like if someone does happen to read this, it's not going to like create too much friction. And I'm still working on it. Like there's still stuff that is too obtuse in my opinion, but it's definitely like I think my sort of guiding sense is just my frustration with these games and sort of my difficulty with reading paragraphs, basically. And I try to just like I don't know. It's been iterated a couple times. Like I'm glad you didn't see what these ability descriptions looked like 3 months ago because it was like an unbroken paragraph, and it wasn't consistent like language or anything. So it's a process. But yeah, my goal is to make it easy to read when you have to read it. uh I don't know. There's all these different ideas. Like at one point I experimented with using like icons for damage types. Instead of writing out like fire, there'd be a little flame, and that was almost worse for some reason. I don't know if I like that more. I think like honestly, I just like for that particular design element for describing what things did. It's easy to sort of get discouraged and like lost in what is actually easy for people to see. So I mean, recently I looked at Rift Wizard actually, and I rewrote my abilities to sort of look like that, because I didn't like I'd sort of lost the ability to tell if like how much information I should have on the screen. And the other thing is that you are like kind of making it for people that have played things in this genre. So there's a common language to these types of RPGs. And there is sort of a sacrifice in sort of general appeal that you make to make the descriptions shorter, I guess. Like to use some of this like RPG shorthand, like on hit, that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know. It's something that I'm gonna definitely like. I don't like to think about it, but I'm gonna probably iterate again on it. But it's every time I do it, I definitely keep moving it towards, um, I guess simplicity and being able to like scan something and get information. But I mean that's sort of there's tension between that, and I also I like sort of equations behind the scene and like and like percent chances to hit and percent chance to block and like all these mechanics happening just in a single like bump combat move. I like the idea of all these things going on behind the scenes, and I like how those can be used to sort of produce what I was talking about earlier with like themed power expressions, like somebody who uses a shield that needs high defense and high block, and then they do something when they block, and this is your percent chance, and you're disadvantaged if they have high accuracy, and just stuff like that. Like, and it's something that were like once you decide to go down that road of having like stats and equations, like there's a level of obtuseness that like is constantly being struggled against. So I don't know. All I can really say is that I'm still working on it, but I'm glad that it feels like somewhat readable. And I've been really impressed that people that have been playing it like kind of figured it out so quickly. I honestly wasn't expecting that. I still feel like it's too unclear.
Something I will kind of bounce off of that you mentioned earlier on was you tried using images briefly instead of like just writing fire or something. So there's a joke in my chat when I stream that is literally the Paradox Europa Universalis design aesthetic, where every single icon is a button and you don't know if it's a button or not because it looks exactly the same as the UI behind it, but everything's really pretty looking and has a very nicely inscribed painting for it. Fuck if I know what it's supposed to do. It's a little face looking left. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean I've been playing a lot of like Slay the Spire does that, I think. I played another card game roguelike, Across the Obelisk, that was out, and they do that all the time. Like it's like a series of little images that, like, I mean, if you're invested in, you know, what's pleasurable about the game, then you'll sort of learn what it does. But I don't know. I did it in this, and I just sort of hated it, and I couldn't really explain why. It didn't work for me.
Endless Legend and Endless Space are also particularly bad for that. Like, the learning curve of that game isn't that high. The learning curve is, okay, what's the purple star? Okay, what's the red arrow? It's like, what's the gold? Like, I need like a cheat sheet to just print out to like tape under my monitor to be like, hey, what's that? It's like StarCraft combinations.
Yeah, it's true linguistically too. Like with Magic cards, like they have keywords, you know, and I think you can do that, or use symbols if it's a game that like people are gonna be playing for 10 years, and it's going to be like a ton of people. They're all gonna want to learn it. I just felt, I don't know, I felt like I couldn't justify doing that because I'm making like this little roguelike. I'm trying to keep it small scoped. It feels like presumptuous to have people sort of expect people to memorize like a unique sort of visual language. And it, like I think I definitely I think it can be useful if you have a larger scoped game, but I don't know. It just felt like it was asking too much.
For sure. Well, I first off want to say a real quick thank you for taking some time to chat with me about your game that you're working on. And if you could real quick do us all a favor of telling people where they can find it, where they can download it, and where they can follow any kind of dev blogs you got.
Yeah. So to find it, it's on itch.io, and it's playable in browser or Windows download. I basically talk about it a lot on Twitter, at Ulfsire. And yeah, that's basically all that I use right now. I'm trying to make a Steam page, but that's sort of like that's challenging me in new ways. But I'll get that done eventually. But at the moment, it's playable in browser and for free download for Windows on itch.io.
And fantastic. And I'm just kind of curious, just because people almost always ask this with unfinished games. How often are you updating it currently?
I'm trying to like release an update once a week. Like I used to be like updating it like daily. I'd add like one ability and that kind of thing. But I feel like that's not very sort of interesting for people that are following it. Like they want to see a bunch of changes at once. So I'm trying to do like sort of a weekly just update, either big or small, where I add more stuff. And it's still happening. If it changes, I'll probably talk about it on Twitter. But so far, like it's just been an absolute pleasure adding stuff to it and seeing people like. I also have a Discord link in my Twitter, but so people in the Discord showing me what they do and how they beat the game and that kind of thing has been just a lot of fun.
Hell yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me, and hopefully people check out your game and enjoyed the interview.